Welcome to Washington Today for March 20th, 2023. I'm Gary Starkoff. Thanks a lot for listening today. President Biden issued the first veto of his administration today on a Republican-led resolution that reverses a rule that allows pension managers to take into consideration environmental, social, and corporate governance factors in their investment decisions. House Republicans are in Orlando, Florida this week for their annual Issues Conference, banking and the economy also on their minds. And House Speaker Kevin McCarthy promising an investigation into the Silicon Valley Bank failure. And as Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin started a three-day summit in Moscow, with Secretary of State Antony Blinken warning, quote, the world should not be fooled by a potential Chinese-Russian peace plan to end the war in Ukraine. We begin this afternoon at the White House, where banking and investment issues were on the agenda. Here's Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
Can you give us a sense of next steps in this? You expressed confidence that the banking system is strong, but there's still some jitters out there.
Understood. Look, the president has already called for Congress to make it easier for regulators to do the following: claw back compensation, impose civil penalties, and ban executives from working in the banking industry. He will also going to call on Congress and bank regulators to strengthen the rules for larger banks so this doesn't happen again. As you know, and I've said this many times before, in 2018, we saw that the previous administration rolled back some of the tough requirements put in place under the Obama-Biden administration, and so which was put in place to strengthen the financial system. So the administration is going to actively look into what regulations or laws should be strengthened to prevent this from happening again. But look, the actions that we saw this weekend, the actions that we have seen over the past 10 days or so, should give the American people confidence that depositors will have their money, will be there when they need it. And so again, we have done everything that we can to make sure that we hold the managers of these banks accountable, and that this does not affect, and we don't put on the hook, the taxpayers or the American people.
Is the president worried, or is the White House worried about the politics of this in terms of banks getting bailouts and average Americans, so to say, not?
So look, the president made a commitment to make sure, and you heard also Secretary Yellen speak to this last week, and making sure that they're not put on the hook for this, right? Making sure that that the investors, as I just mentioned, the managers are held accountable. And so the president has made decisive, forceful actions to strengthen, again, the public confidence in our banking system. No taxpayers' money is being used or put at risk with these actions that have been taken over the last 10 days or so, and our banking system remains sound. That is something that you heard from Secretary Yellen directly herself just last week, and this is all done because of the president's direction that he asked the regulators to take a look at, that he asked the Treasury Department to take a look at and make sure that we make these decisive actions. Again, we just saw some decisive action this weekend, and so we want to make sure, and we're doing this to make sure that the American people are confident in the work that this administration is trying to do to make sure that we meet the demands. The resources for depositors are met.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre at today's press briefing. You can see the entire event at cspan.org. Confidence in the banking system was also on the mind of House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Speaking at the House Republicans' Issue Conference in Orlando, Florida, he promised a look into the potential causes of the Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank failures.
We watched Silicon Valley Bank get into this situation. But when you sit back and look, and I know the chairman, Patrick McHenry, will do a number of hearings on this to really get to the bottom. We watched them park a great deal amount of money into long-term bonds. Not a smart move, knowing that inflation was going up with interest rates. But we also watched that they're a state bank. So yes, we will probe where were the mistakes. Did the California regulators miss something? I think we'll have a lot of questions for the Governor Gavin Newsom about this as well. I know he's familiar with this bank. I believe some of his companies are actually banked with this bank. We've also watched that as inflation grew by the Democrats spend more, it always puts more jeopardy into a community bank. And I think community banks are very important and we have to keep them. Community banks are the ones that take the risk in our cities and our counties that will make the development that others, the big banks, will not. I do not want to become a country like Canada. What do they have, 5 banks? And Ireland only has a couple name brands on both of them. I think it's important that we're able to stabilize this. And I think looking at the financial services, they'll do their hearings, and they'll understand what we need. I don't believe it's a regulation problem. They're there. Did some miss the jobs they were supposed to do? Did the feds? Yes. But it's the real culprit of all of this that has put jeopardy into this is the spending that the Democrats did that brought us inflation, lied to us about it being transitory. Even the Secretary of Treasury apologized a year later. The American public has actually been hurt, not just in the price of eggs, not just their money won't go as far, but now worried about whether their money would even be or their local bank can stay around. We will work hard to make sure that they are protected. And the one thing I would add to this, if you look at the Congressional Budget Office's numbers after the Democrats have taken over and spent all that money, now in this 10-year window, for the very first time, 3 of the trust funds will go broke: transportation, Medicare, and Social Security. By the president doing nothing, by the Democrats raising how much money they did and bringing inflation, they're harming Medicare and Social Security. They're actually going to bring cuts to it. We also watched for the first time, the CBO tells us in the next 10 years, the American public will have to spend of their hard-working money $10.5 trillion just on interest. This is just paying the interest on your credit card. But if America really knew from 1940 to today that they've only had to spend $9 trillion on interest for the last 83 years, but the next 10 years they're going to spend $10.5 trillion, I think they would want something to happen, especially before the debt ceiling.
House Speaker Kevin McCarthy speaking in Orlando, Florida, where House Republicans are holding their issues conference. And more on President Biden's veto today. It was on a Republican-led resolution that overturns a rule that allows retirement fund managers to consider the impact of so-called ESG factors when choosing investments. ESG stands for environmental, social, and corporate governance. Here's what the president had to say.
I just signed this veto because the legislation passed by the Congress would put at risk the retirement savings of individuals across the country. They couldn't take into consideration investments that wouldn't be impacted by climate, impacted by overpaying executives, and that's why I decided to veto it. It makes sense to veto it.
That resolution passed the House and had bipartisan support in the Senate, with Democratic Senators Joe Manchin of West Virginia and John Tester of Montana voting with Republicans, who say the rule is, quote, woke policy. Democrats say it's not about ideology and will help investors. As we mentioned, House Republicans are in Florida for their Issues Conference. We talked to Politico's Nancy Vu about the impact of the Conservative Freedom Caucus on the policy and strategy discussions now happening in Orlando.
Well, I think their influence during the speakership vote speaks to how large their influence is within the Republican caucus, right? They make up a large portion of the caucus already, and McCarthy relied on them in order to get their speakership vote. And now their influence over the policy fights over the budget and the debt ceiling are also playing out as well. So the day after President Joe Biden had released his budget plan, the House Freedom Caucus had also released a one-page of their bare minimum ask. And basically, this is what would get them to vote on a bill to raise the debt ceiling. A lot of their main ask has always been consistent on reducing federal spending, balancing the federal budget, and keeping spending levels at 2022 levels.
And we can give viewers some of those specific details, capping non-defense discretionary spending at fiscal 2022 levels for the next decade, rescinding unspent pandemic funds, repealing mandatory spending in the Democrats' climate tax and health law, blocking the president's student debt relief executive action, imposing work requirements on various federal benefit programs like Medicaid, enacting legislation to curb government regulations, spur domestic energy production. These are the asks that you're talking about. How many of those are likely to make it into some sort of final compromise?
Well, the ask of trying to balance federal federal spending while also keeping it at 22 levels is a large ask, right? I think a lot of policy analysis have been centered around the fact that this is pretty impossible, but the plan that House Republicans may propose, we'll just have to see what they come up with. But overall, I think it's going to be a large task for Kevin McCarthy to also coalesce around a plan that other Republicans would support as well.
Nancy Vu is our guest this morning, a Congress reporter for Politico. And what is the name of the note that you work on at Politico?
Congress Minutes.
Congress Minutes. And what is Congress Minutes for viewers who don't know?
It's a platform that covers everything about Congress and often the stories that are overlooked. We cover hearings, we cover bill introductions, anything that is of the interest to those that work on Capitol Hill and also those that just observe it as political junkies.
What's a story that was overlooked last week that you covered there?
So during St. Patty's Day, there was Representative Brian Fitzpatrick introduced a bill that would make St. Patrick's Day a federal holiday.
And how likely is that to become law?
We'll have to see how many people coalesce around this, hopefully bipartisan issue.
So we want to stay on Republicans for a second, but shift over to the Senate. What do we know about any health updates when it comes to Mitch McConnell?
So the latest update was last week when Senator Mitch McConnell's office released a statement about how he's doing. And essentially he's been discharged from the hospital, but also it was revealed that he had a minor rib fracture and now he is recuperating within a rehab center. We're not sure when Senator Mitch McConnell will return to the Senate, but his absence has definitely been felt amongst the Republican caucus. Senator John Thune is now working in conjunction with McConnell's aides to try and help steer the caucus forward, essentially.
And what are going to be the key policy issues this week in the Senate and the House as well when House Republicans get back? So first, the Senate specifically, they're looking to vote on repealing the 1991 and 2002 AUMF. Essentially, authorization for use of military force for those not in D.C.
Exactly. And this would essentially end the Gulf and Iraq wars. The first measure, or the first step to repealing these AUMFs, was taken last Thursday, and it was voted significantly bipartisanly. The vote was 68 to 27. So I think for the most part, even with Senate absences, with Senator Mitch McConnell out, and also Senator Feinstein and also Senator John Fetterman also out, I think that this measure won't have any trouble of getting past the finish line.
And how does President Biden feel about that effort?
President Biden has vocalized, I believe, support for the issue, but we'll have to see how it plays out.
That's one of the key issues on the Senate side. And what about the House side this week?
So the House side is now focusing on passing the Parents' Bill of Rights Act. They're readying the legislation for this week. And what essentially it does is that it's a key component of Kevin McCarthy's Commitment to America Act, and it would amend the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. It would require schools to provide parents with a list of books and reading materials and also make accessible their curriculum. It also affirms parents' rights to essentially challenge the school curriculum and address school boards and also receive information about violent activity in their schools.
Politico's Nancy Vu on today's Washington Journal. You can see the whole segment at cspan.org/Washington Journal and on the C-SPAN Now video app. In a new report out today, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned that the world is off track to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. The Paris Agreement aimed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above average because as the world gets warmer, climate change's impact is expected to get more intense and harder to reverse. The report found that global warming pollution is at its highest levels in human history, putting the world on track for more than 3 degrees warming above average and putting the Paris goal at risk. The report says that climate change solutions are available now, but that nations need to ramp that technology up faster than ever. And here's Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm talking about how moving to cleaner energy technology can help create jobs.
To what extent do you think the debate over climate change and the necessity to do something about it is going to shift as the economic dimension of this debate becomes more explicit, as people in red states see that clean energy can mean jobs?
Yeah, really important. I mean, those states, they all want to keep their young people in working there as well. And many young people really want to be part of something bigger than themselves. So fighting climate change is one way to do that, but also to get good paying jobs. And so there's several dimensions of this that red states can love. For example, making sure the jobs exist. So you're going to be talking to Governor DeWine. I mean, Governor DeWine in Ohio has benefited enormously from the Inflation Reduction Act. You had Honda coming to announce battery factories. You had Ultium, which is partnered with GM, another battery factory in Lordstown. You have solar expansions from First Solar, one of their legacy solar companies, saying that they're going to expand as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act, and the chips factory that you're going to talk to him about as well. Industrial states, whether you're red or blue, are going to see an enormous influx of investment from these companies who are going to take advantage of this act. And yes, a lot of this is going to red states. The battery belt has shaped around Michigan, Ohio, Tennessee, Georgia, and those states should see that it's in their best interest to be able to embrace the companies that want to go there and give jobs to their citizens, keep their young people there. As I say, it's a $23 trillion market, and you better believe all these states could benefit from it. And you are seeing a lot of these investments going to traditionally red states.
And we heard Secretary Granholm mention Ohio Republican Governor Mike DeWine. Here he is on the growth of broader technology sector jobs in his state.
So I'm interested in your views on both the wisdom and limits of this sort of federal industrial policy. I think it's accurate to say, at least since the Reagan era, the standard Republican view has always been that free markets worked best at rendering economic decisions, and that the government was wasteful and inefficient and really a source of trouble for the economy as often as anything else. So what's changed? And if massive government subsidies for the semiconductor industry are a good idea, why not have the government subsidize a whole bunch of other industries?
Well, I think that's a very good question. When I went to the United States House of Representatives, Ronald Reagan was president. And so 8 years in the House and 12 years in the United States Senate, I understand, what you're saying about basic Republican philosophy of government backing off. But I think facts have changed. We have a very aggressive competitor in regard to China that will steal. They'll do anything that they need to do. They subsidize certainly industries that they think need to be subsidized. And it's not only China that does that. We're seeing other countries that do that, and certainly most, if not all, the countries that are really our competitors in regard to chip manufacturing. I don't have to tell you, or our listeners, or viewers, that how important chips are. Fran and I wanted to buy a truck a year or so ago, for a pickup truck for our farm, and I called my dealer up and I told him what I wanted. He said, "Look, you're going to be lucky to get what we can get you, and it's going to be 3 months, 4 months, 5 months." And so many Americans saw that because of the fact that we didn't have chips. We didn't have chips for a pickup truck. We don't have chips for automobiles and the ripple effect that has. So I think it's a different world today. I think that we certainly cannot and should not be subsidizing every industry, but I think making strategic decisions that are in the national interest of the United States makes eminent sense. And the CHIP Act decision, to put the CHIP Act on for Congress to actually pass it, I think also makes a great deal of sense, not just for our economy, but also for national defense.
Ohio Republican Governor Mike DeWine and Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm speaking to Washington Post Live. You're listening to Washington Today.
Live Tuesday on C-SPAN Radio at 10 a.m. Eastern, Army Chief of Staff General James McConville discusses the Army's modernization efforts, readiness, and the war in Ukraine. He'll be at the Brookings Institution. That's live Tuesday, 10 a.m. Eastern, on C-SPAN Radio. Also on the C-SPAN Now app, streamed at cspan.org, or on your smart speaker. Say play C-SPAN Radio.
Welcome back to Washington today. American aid worker Jeffrey Woodkey, who was kidnapped and held hostage by terrorists in the West African country of Niger, has been released. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan tweeted on Monday, quote, "I'm gratified and relieved to see the release of U.S. hostage Jeff Woodkey after over 6 years in captivity. The U.S. thanks Niger for its help in bringing him home. To all who miss him and love him, I thank so many across our government who've worked tirelessly toward securing his freedom." U.S. officials have been working on the release for years. Secretary of State Antony Blinken also praised the efforts of the Niger government and said, quote, "As you know, I have no higher priority or focus than bringing home any unjustly detained American, wherever that is in the world. We won't rest until they're all home and, like Jeffrey, reunited with their families."
Уважаемый президент Путин, я всегда называю вас как моим дорогим другом. 我非常高兴能够应你之约再一次访问俄罗斯。
That is the voice of Chinese President Xi Jinping speaking through a Russian translator, calling Russian President Vladimir Putin "my dear friend." Came at the start of a 3-day meeting between the two leaders in Moscow. President Xi is the first international leader to meet with President Putin since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it comes just days after the International Criminal Court in The Hague accused the Russian president of committing war crimes in Ukraine and issued a warrant for his arrest. Here in Washington, Secretary of State Antony Blinken voiced skepticism about any peace proposals for the Ukraine conflict that could come out of the meeting.
Today and throughout this week, President Xi is meeting with President Putin in Russia. We expect that China may use this visit to reiterate calls for a ceasefire under its peace proposal. The United States welcomes any initiative that advances a just and durable peace. China's proposal includes elements that we have long supported, including ensuring nuclear safety, resolving the humanitarian crisis, protecting civilians, and indeed, the first element calls for upholding sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all countries. The fundamental element of any plan for ending the war in Ukraine and producing a just and durable peace must be upholding the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine in accordance with the United Nations Charter. Any plan that does not prioritize this critical principle is a stalling tactic at best, or is merely seeking to facilitate an unjust outcome. That is not constructive diplomacy. Calling for a ceasefire that does not include the removal of Russian forces from Ukrainian territory would effectively be supporting the ratification of Russian conquest. It would recognize Russia's attempts to seize the sovereign neighbor's territory by force. It would enable Russia to further entrench positions in Ukraine. And a ceasefire now, without a durable solution, would allow President Putin to rest and refit his troops and then restart the war at a time more advantageous to Russia. The world should not be fooled by any tactical move by Russia, supported by China or any other country, to freeze the war on its own terms. Such a move would violate the UN Charter and defy the will of 141 countries who have condemned Russia's war in the United Nations General Assembly. One party to this conflict, Ukraine, has already put forward a just peace formula. If China is committed to supporting an end to the war based on the principles of the UN Charter, as called for in point 1 of its plan, it can engage with President Zelensky and Ukraine on that basis and use its influence to compel Moscow to pull back its forces. Russia's purported annexation of sovereign Ukrainian territory, including vast areas it doesn't even control, and its ongoing brutal attacks on civilians make clear that President Putin currently has no interest in such a peace. That President Xi is traveling to Russia days after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for President Putin suggests that China feels no responsibility to hold the Kremlin accountable for the atrocities committed in Ukraine, and instead of even condemning them, it would rather provide diplomatic cover for Russia to continue to commit those very crimes.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken speaking at a press conference today on the State Department's annual Human Rights Report. That annual report, which is mandated by law and submitted to Congress, outlines human rights conditions in countries and regions across the globe. Also speaking on the report, and specifically about what it says about alleged Russian war crimes in Ukraine, was Beth Von Schack, U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice.
My question is, this report talks about a multitude of war crimes that have been committed by Russia in Ukraine. And so I'm wondering if you can bring us up to date on efforts to share U.S. evidence of war crimes committed in Ukraine by the Russians with the ICC, just given, obviously, we saw what they came out with last week regarding one war crime, but the U.S. clearly has evidence of multiple war crimes that have been committed. So can you just update us as to where those conversations and efforts stand?
Yeah, indeed. Last week, a pretrial chamber of the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for President Putin and his children's commissioner, Maria Lvova-Belova, charging both of them with deportation and forced transfer of civilians and specifically of children. So it's a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions, and we've discussed that here when we talked about the crimes against humanity determination that was made. This has now been charged as war crimes. We have appreciated new authorities that Congress has given us when it comes to our ability to interact with the court and to potentially share information. We're looking for ways to be helpful. We generally don't talk about the specifics of what we do share because in many respects that might reveal prosecutorial trajectories, for example, or undermine the safety and security of witnesses. But we are looking for ways to support this, and we have been supporting accountability from the beginning when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war, in particular supporting the work of the Prosecutor General in Ukraine, who has primary jurisdiction over all of the war crimes and other atrocities being committed there.
It's Beth Von Schack, U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice, speaking at the State Department today. You can see the whole State Department briefing at cspan.org. And earlier today on Fox News, Tennessee Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn talked about why she thinks President Biden is to blame for China's push to dominance.
Maria, this is the axis of evil, as I call them, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Yeah. And what you have is China is the leader of this pack. We know they're helping to bankroll Russia right now. They are buying their oil. They're helping to finance Iran, manufacturing drones in Russia. They're encouraging North Korea to send rockets to Russia. So here you see them beginning to build out what they see as their path to domination over us. Couple this with the fact that China is expanding their Belt and Road Initiative into the Western Hemisphere. And Biden is weak. Xi Jinping knows this. And he feels like he's got some running room right now. And Gordon Chang, who is always so good on this, will talk about how China plans to be globally dominant by the time we get to 2050. And they feel like this is their time to really make some headway. And they see this as their open window, and it is going to be up to us to stop them.
And Joe Biden doesn't appear ready to stop them at all. He has yet to bring up the origins of COVID-19 and China's culpability and the fact that they covered it up for so long. He's yet to bring up the fentanyl to knock it off to Xi Jinping, the intellectual property theft. And now, of course, last week we got the Biden family bank records. James Comer was with me Sunday, and he told me that this is the first deal, but there are 11 more where Biden family may have taken money from foreign powers. How's he going to respond to Xi Jinping with all of this?
And this is the problem. You have to say, are they compromised or are they fearful of what China will do to Biden Incorporated? And is that why they're not going after it? But as you said, COVID, fentanyl, look at the $1 trillion trade deficit that we have. Joe Biden should call Xi Jinping and say, you know that $1 trillion trade deficit? If you don't knock off the fentanyl, if you don't come clean on COVID, we're going to stop that.
Right.
And China has to have that. They've got to have the U.S. market. They had the best year they've ever had.
Tennessee Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn speaking with Fox Business's Maria Bartiromo earlier today. And finally, in a scene that looked a little like an AFC Richmond postgame press conference, actor Jason Sudeikis and the cast of Ted Lasso joined the White House press briefing today ahead of a meeting with President Biden to discuss efforts to address mental health. Sudeikis, who plays the title character on the Apple TV show, which has included multiple episodes touching on mental health, called on Americans to not be afraid to ask for help if they need it.
So please, we encourage everyone, and this is a big theme of the show, is like to check in with your neighbor, your coworker, your friends, your family, and ask how they're doing, and listen sincerely. You all ask questions for a living, but you also listen for a living. So, who am I preaching to? The choir, that is. Okay. And while it's easier said than done, we also have to know that we shouldn't be afraid to ask for help ourselves, and that does take a lot, especially when it's something that has such a negative stigma to it, such as mental health, and it doesn't need to be that way. And if you can ask for that help from a professional, fantastic. If it needs to be a loved one, equally as good in a lot of ways, because sometimes you just need to let that pressure valve release. The president is working on, and his own team, although his team is real, our team is make-believe, and don't think I don't know that, despite what the people at FIFA and EA will tell you. We are actually a make-believe team, but they're working very hard to make sure that that option is available to as many Americans as possible. Now, look, I know in this town, a lot of folks don't always agree, right? And don't always feel heard, seen, listened to, yes? But I truly believe that we should all do our best to help take care of each other. That's my own personal belief. I think that's something that everybody up here on stage believes in. That's things we talked about in the writer's room, and we talk about in the editing room, and everything in between.
Ted Lasso star Jason Sudeikis at today's White House press briefing talking about the importance of mental health care. You can see the entire briefing, which did include a question from The Independent's Trent Krim, at cspan.org. That's also where you can find this program as a podcast. You can also find it wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like more on stories that are shaping Washington, you can subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter, word for word. Just go to cspan.org/connect to subscribe. I'm Gary Sterkoff. Thanks a lot for listening today to Washington Today.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Every day we take your calls live on the air on the news of the day, and we discuss policy issues that impact you. Coming up Tuesday morning, Virginia Gentles of the Independent Women's Forum discusses the proposed Parents' Bill of Rights legislation in the House, as well as similar efforts across the U.S. And then Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Policy Vice President Avenel Joseph talks about the end of the pandemic-era continuous coverage requirement for Medicaid participants. Watch Washington Journal live at 7 Eastern Tuesday morning on C-SPAN or on C-SPAN Now, our free mobile video app. Join the discussion with your phone calls, Facebook comments, texts, and tweets.